Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of precision. It feels almost like engineering.
Right, like you could just measure it perfectly.
Exactly. I mean, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, well, there it is.
Yeah, it's undeniable.
But when you step into the world of mental health, and specifically anxiety disorders, that x-ray machine is completely useless. You are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is just incredibly complex.
And heavily stigmatized, too.
Oh, heavily stigmatized, and frankly, deeply misunderstood by the general public. So we are looking at a fascinating stack of clinical data with you today, along with an operational deep dive on a specific telehealth model from a practice called Coping and Healing Counseling out in Georgia.
Which is really doing some incredible work.
They are, and what this data does is completely flip how we understand and treat social anxiety disorder. Okay, let's unpack this. The core of what we want to unravel for you today is a massive clinical paradox.
Yeah, the paradox is really the center of the whole issue.
Right, it's this question of how do you deliver treatment for a medical condition when the very symptoms of that condition actively prevent the patient from ever seeking help?
It is arguably the ultimate bottleneck in modern psychiatry. I mean, before we get into the mechanics of how to solve that, we really have to establish what we are actually dealing with here.
Because it's not what people think it is.
Not at all.
Yeah.
This is not a conversation about feeling a little bit shy at a crowded party, or getting some butterflies in your stomach before a big presentation.
Right, everyone gets that.
Exactly. We are talking about a highly treatable, yet severely impairing condition that affects roughly 15 million adults in the U.S. alone.
15 million, that is a massive number.
It is. And the diagnostic criteria we are looking at describe an intense, persistent fear of negative evaluation or embarrassment, humiliation, or rejection.
And it has to last for a specific amount of time, right?
Yes, the fear has to persist for 6 months or more. And it has to cause significant impairment in a person's life. Plus, crucially, the fear is entirely out of proportion to the actual threat.
The prevalence numbers in the data really stood out to me. I mean, a 7 to 12% lifetime prevalence in the U.S.
Yeah.
That makes it one of the most common anxiety disorders out there. But what struck me even more is the timeline of it.
The onset, you mean?
Yeah, the onset typically happens in childhood or early adolescence. We aren't usually talking about a condition that suddenly just, materializes in your mid-30s.
Right, and if you think about human development, adolescence is precisely the time when peer evaluation starts to become, well, the single most important thing in a young person's world.
Oh, absolutely. Everything is about fitting in.
Exactly. The brain is literally wiring itself to care about social standing. Because, evolutionarily speaking, being cast out of the tribe meant danger. It meant you might not survive.
So the brain is just doing its job.
It is. But with social anxiety disorder, or SAD, that natural developmental stage gets locked into overdrive. It just doesn't turn off.
And the triggers are not just what you'd see in movies either. It's not just someone hyperventilating before giving a speech at a podium.
Right, public speaking is the cliche.
Yeah, and if your trigger is just public speaking, you can generally organize your life to avoid podiums. But the clinical data highlights triggers like eating in front of others,
Yes.
using public restrooms, simply being observed while you are working at your desk.
Which means the threat is everywhere. I mean, your entire day becomes a minefield. And we have to look at the physical toll of navigating that minefield, too.
Because it's not just in their head.
Not at all. During exposure to these feared situations, the sympathetic nervous system essentially hijacks the body.
Wow.
Individuals experience blushing, sweating, trembling, a racing heart, dry mouth, severe gastrointestinal distress, and noticeable voice changes.
Sounds exhausting.
It's incredibly taxing. The brain is pumping adrenaline and cortisol through the bloodstream as if you were cornered by a physical predator.
Yeah.
But the predator is just, a coworker asking you a casual question in the break room.
Let's draw a line in the sand here, actually, because that intense vertical reaction clears up one of the biggest myths you hear. People say casually all the time, oh, I have social anxiety, I'm just an introvert.
Right. People conflate the two constantly.
Constantly. But based on these clinical facts, those are two entirely different universes. So imagine you're standing at your front door. You want to go to a friend's dinner party.
Correct.
Introversion is choosing to stay home because your couch is comfortable, you have a good book, and you just want to recharge your batteries.
You're making a preference choice.
Exactly. But social anxiety disorder is desperately wanting to go to that dinner party, craving that connection, but feeling like there is a physical, electrified wall blocking your front door.
What's fascinating here is that physical wall analogy is the perfect way to visualize it. Introversion is just a temperament preference regarding where you draw your energy from.
Right.
But social anxiety disorder is a condition of impairing fear. People with SAD often crave social connection deeply. They do not want to be isolated.
I want to be out
They
there.
do. But that electrify wall, which manifests as those very real physiological symptoms we just mentioned, like the racing heart and the GI distress, it makes crossing the threshold feel literally dangerous to their nervous system.
It's a physical barrier.
Yeah, the psychological fear produces a visceral physical feedback loop. You feel anxious, your stomach drops, you notice your voice shaking, which makes you hyper aware that people might notice you shaking.
Which just feeds the panic.
Exactly, which increases the anxiety, which makes the shaking worse. It is incredibly difficult to break that loop on your own.
Which brings us directly to the paradox at the heart of today's deep dive. I mean, if someone is standing in their house, trapped behind that electrified wall, terrified of being judged or interacting with strangers, how do they ever get to a doctor's office to get the help they need?
Historically, they often didn't.
Really?
Yeah, the clinical data points out a tragic reality here. People with social anxiety disorder are dramatically underreferred relative to how common the disorder actually is.
Because they just avoid going.
Right. The defining characteristic of the condition is avoidance. Now, think about the traditional process of seeking mental health treatment. What does it actually require you to do?
It's basically a gauntlet designed entirely out of their worst triggers. I mean, you have to pick up a phone and talk to a stranger, you have to drive to a clinic, you walk into a waiting room full of other people where you feel observed, you have to interact with a receptionist.
It's terrifying for them.
And then, you go into a closed room and reveal your deepest vulnerabilities to yet another stranger.
Exactly. It's like asking someone with a broken leg to run a marathon just to reach the orthopedic surgeon.
Wow, yeah.
The friction is placed precisely where the patient is weakest. And because of this massive barrier, the sources note that a significant number of individuals end up self-medicating.
Let me guess. Alcohol.
Most commonly with alcohol, yeah, just to cope with necessary social situations.
Like having 3 drinks before the office holiday party just to take the edge off so you can walk through the door.
Right. But biologically and psychologically, that alcohol actually worsens the long-term symptoms.
Wait, how does it make it worse?
Well, alcohol depresses the central nervous system temporarily, which feels like relief in the moment. But when it wears off, you experience rebound anxiety. The nervous system essentially overcorrects and becomes even more sensitive.
Oh, so you're actually heightening the baseline anxiety.
Yes. Furthermore, you've robbed your brain of the opportunity to learn that you could have survived the party without the alcohol. So the baseline fear grows, and now you've introduced huge new risks, like co-occurring substance use disorders and severe depression.
So the traditional medical pathway is practically built to keep people with SAD away. And this is where the operational data introduces telehealth as the great bridge.
It completely changes the game.
By moving therapy to a video or phone call, you bypass the waiting room entirely. But let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Sure. Because if you put yourself in the shoes of someone dealing with this, if you are terrified of being observed or evaluated, wouldn't staring into a camera on a video call where you are literally face-to-face with someone analyzing you trigger that exact same panic?
This raises an important question, and clinicians had to grapple with that exact issue when telehealth first started expanding. And the answer is yes. A video call is absolutely still going to induce anxiety for a patient with SAD.
So it's not a magic cure-all for the fear?
No, it is not frictionless. Therapy requires engaging with the fear. However, what telehealth does is eliminate the cascading series of unpredictable social landmines.
Ah, the unpredictable part.
Exactly. On a telehealth call, the patient controls their physical environment. They can be in their own bedroom. They can hold a comfort object off camera. They can control the lighting.
That makes a lot of sense.
They don't have to worry about who is staring at them in the waiting room, or whether the receptionist is judging their outfit or navigating traffic on the commute.
It's contained.
Right. Telehealth doesn't cure the anxiety of the interaction itself, but it reduces the barrier of entry just enough to get them in the virtual door. It makes the logistics of starting treatment survivable.
You're stripping away the uncontrolled variables so they only have to face one trigger at a time, the therapist.
Precisely.
Okay, so they make it over that lowered barrier and get into the virtual room. What actually happens next? Because another huge misconception the sources point out is the idea of what therapy actually looks like.
Oh, definitely.
People picture the classic movie trope. where you are forced to stand up in a circle of folding chairs and talk about your feelings to a group of strangers.
Group therapy actually is an evidence-based option for SAD, and it works remarkably well for some because it provides a built-in exposure environment.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but it is never forced, and it is not the standard starting point. The first-line treatment is individual, one-on-one therapy, and the gold standard approach here, according to the clinical data, is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, combined with graduated exposure.
Graduated exposure meaning slowly, systematically facing the fear. The data specifies both in vivo and imaginal exposure.
Right, so facing the fear in real life and facing it in your imagination during the session.
But let's break down the actual mechanics of CBT, because the terms therapists use are cognitive restructuring and behavioral experiments. What does a behavioral experiment actually look like for someone terrified of judgment?
Well, let's start with the cognitive restructuring part first. People with SAD often make rapid, catastrophic predictions.
Like worst case scenarios.
Exactly. Let's say the fear is speaking in a meeting. The internal thought process is, if my voice shakes during this meeting, everyone will think I'm completely incompetent, my boss will lose faith in me, and I'll get fired.
That escalates fast.
It does. Cognitive restructuring involves examining that exact thought and dismantling it logically with the therapist. Has anyone else ever stuttered in a meeting?
Probably.
Did they get fired on the spot? Probably not.
Yeah.
So once you poke holes in the catastrophic prediction, you move to the behavioral experiment, which is actually testing that prediction in the real world.
So if we look at this through a tech lens, it sounds exactly like a software update.
I like that.
The brain's threat detection algorithm, the amygdala, is falsely predicting a catastrophic system crash every single time the person enters a social situation. And the therapist is essentially helping them run safe, controlled beta tests to prove to the nervous system that it actually won't crash.
That is incredibly close to the biology of it, actually. Every time you avoid a social situation, your brain logs that avoidance as a successful survival tactic.
It thinks it saved your life.
Yes. The brain says we avoided the meeting and we didn't die. Avoidance kept us alive. Over time, that faulty algorithm gets reinforced through negative reinforcement.
Right.
So graduated exposure systematically rewrites that algorithm. You run the beta test. The therapist might say, your homework this week is to go to a coffee shop, order a drink, and deliberately stumble over your words.
Wow. Deliberately make the mistake they're terrified of.
Yes. The brain predicts total disaster, that the barista will laugh, the crowd will stare, social ruin. You go, you order the drink, you stumble over the words, and what happens?
The barista just asks if you want oat milk or regular.
Exactly. You survive, you take your coffee, you leave. The brain registers the new data. Wait, the prediction was wrong. We stuttered, and the system didn't crash. Do that enough times, progressing to harder and harder scenarios, and neuroplasticity takes over. The algorithm updates.
What's really encouraging in the source material is the timeline for this update. The data says many people see meaningful change in just 12 to 20 sessions.
It's relatively fast.
Yeah. We aren't talking about lying on a psychoanalyst's couch for 10 years talking about your childhood. This is a highly targeted, highly effective, active intervention.
It is extremely structured. And alongside the CBT, the clinical data notes that there are FDA-approved medication options that can help lower the baseline anxiety enough for the exposure therapy to even be possible.
Right, the data mentions that.
Yeah, the primary recommendations are SSRIs, like sertraline, paroxetine, and escitalopram, or SNRIs, like venlafaxine.
The sources make a very strict, specific note here, though, and I want to highlight this. They say avoid benzodiazepines for long-term use. Why is that distinction so critical if the goal is to just reduce anxiety?
It comes back to the neurobiology of how we learn. Benzodiazepines act very quickly to suppress anxiety. They are essentially sedatives that quiet the central nervous system. But because they dull the nervous system so effectively, they actually prevent the brain from experiencing the mild stress required to learn those new safety signals during the behavioral experiments.
Oh, wow. So they block the update.
Yes. You cannot rewrite the threat detection algorithm if the entire system is artificially powered down. You won't form the memory of surviving the stress because the medication prevented you from feeling the stress in the first place.
That is fascinating.
And plus, there is a high risk of dependency. SSRIs and SNRIs, on the other hand, help regulate neurotransmitters like serotonin and norepinephrine over time, creating a more stable emotional baseline without interfering with the active learning process of CBT.
Okay, so we've got the cognitive software update, we've got the behavioral beta testing, we've got the hardware support through the right medications if needed.
Right.
But having the best software update in the world is completely useless if people can't actually download it.
That is the reality.
The science isn't the roadblock anymore, the logistics are. And that brings us to the operational data from Coping and Healing Counseling, or CHC, in Georgia, who are trying to completely redesign how patients access this exact care.
We know the treatment works, but access has always been the bottleneck. The operational overview of CHC gives us a very clear picture of how modern practices are engineering their systems to obliterate that bottleneck,
Yeah.
entirely around the concept of removing friction.
Let's outline the red flags first, just so if you are listening, you know when this level of intervention is actually necessary.
Good idea.
The clinical guidance suggests seeking care when avoidance starts interfering with work, school, friendships, or relationships. If you are using alcohol to manage basic social situations,
Yes.
or if you have persistent dread of upcoming events weeks in advance, or, and this is a big one, if the physical symptoms themselves, the blushing, the shaking, the sweating, become so severe that you are actively avoiding situations just to prevent the physical symptoms from happening.
It becomes the fear of the fear. You aren't just afraid of the party anymore. You are afraid of having a panic attack at the party.
Exactly. So practically speaking, let's say someone listening in Georgia recognizes these red flags in themselves, or maybe in their teenager. Finding a licensed clinical specialist who actually takes insurance, understands graduated exposure therapy, and doesn't have a 6-month wait list is usually a nightmare.
It's incredibly difficult.
Does the telehealth model from CHC actually fix that?
The data from their operational model shows that it does, primarily by leveraging a 100% remote, HIPAA-compliant video platform to serve all 159 counties in Georgia.
All 159 counties, that's huge.
It is. They have a roster of licensed clinical specialists treating teens from age 13 all the way through adulthood, managing not just SID, but depression, trauma, and PTSD.
Okay.
But the real structural shift is in the accessibility. They've used telehealth to essentially guarantee same-week scheduling.
Oh, wow. Same week.
Yes. And crucially, they haven't just built a cash-only private practice. They're integrated with major commercial insurances, where session copays typically sit between $10 and $40. And more importantly, they accept a Medicaid with a $0 copay.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When you look at the impact of those operational facts, it's massive. Because if a listener in Georgia recognizes these red flags, the financial and geographical barriers are basically gone, right? Think about rural Georgia. Think about those 159 counties.
Exactly.
Historically, if you lived in a rural county, your access to a specialist trained in exposure therapy for social anxiety disorder was likely zero. You would have to drive hours into Atlanta or Savannah, adding massive logistical and financial stress to the already paralyzing social stress.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it represents a fundamental shift in democratizing mental health care. By combining same-week scheduling, remote access, and $0 Medicaid options, the traditional financial and geographical barriers drop away.
It's leveling the playing field.
It really is. They are taking the most effective, evidence-based cure and delivering it directly into the living rooms of the people whose disease specifically prevents them from leaving their living rooms. It meets the patient exactly where the disorder has trapped them.
And for anyone in Georgia looking to connect with that specific resource, the operational data lists their contact as haeastherapy.com or by phone at area code 404-832-0102.
It's a great resource.
So as we wrap up this journey, we've uncovered how social anxiety disorder is a severely impairing, intensely physical condition driven by a faulty threat detection algorithm in the brain.
Right.
It is not just a personality quirk. But through the clever, friction-reducing use of telehealth, the biggest structural barrier to treatment, the gauntlet of the waiting room, can be bypassed.
Absolutely.
And this allows proven neuroplasticity-driven methods like cognitive behavioral therapy to actually reach the patient and do the work of rewiring that fear.
It is a profound example of technology removing the friction from healthcare. But, analyzing these sources and thinking about how telehealth creates this safe remote bubble, it does leave me with a broader question about the society we are building.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, if telehealth, remote work, and grocery delivery apps are the perfect logistical workarounds for social anxiety because they remove in-person exposure, Could the increasing normalization of a completely remote life actually make it easier for people to hide their symptoms from themselves?
Oh, wow.
Could our increasingly digital world be allowing people to flawlessly avoid all of their triggers, perfectly designing their isolated lives around their fear, and ultimately delaying the realization that they are suffering and actually need this very treatment?
That is a fascinating and honestly a slightly haunting thought. Are we inadvertently building a world so comfortable and isolated that we never realize we're trapped behind that wall?
It's definitely something to consider.
Something for all of you to mull over, whether you are working from a home office today or stepping back out into the physical world. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. Keep questioning the world around you, keep challenging your own assumptions, and we will catch you next time.